Things are bad and they are getting worse. We're getting poorer and poorer. Whose fault is it though? Putin's? Trump's? Or is it powerful elites and corporations making needless, unnecessary, greedy profit? You decide. Hey, you 5.7 million awakening wonders. Here we ride the algorithm together, remaining intelligent, staying awake, ignoring the mainstream media where necessary, finding new ways of coming together to create new freedom, both inside our consciousness and outside our consciousness. And for all we know, we are just nodes within an all-pervading conscious entity. How could we ever know? No one knows yet. We'll work it out by the end of the show. If you don't subscribe yet, subscribe right now. And please turn on that notification bell so that we can continue to cheat an algorithm that wants to keep us dumb. Let's stay free and stay awake, everybody. So, you will be aware that people are talking a lot about Putin's price hikes and why everything's much more expensive now and why we're getting poorer and why life since COVID has become a living hell, a perpetual nightmare, why Armageddon is upon us. Why is it happening? Is it because of Putin? Is it because of Trump? To illustrate some of these ideas, we're going to be looking at Krystal, friend of the show, who went on Bill Maher this week. But before we get to Maher and Bull, let's have a look at the cause for all the problems that have ever happened. Trump.
Bill Maher, right? Everybody know Bill Maher, for example? He's a radical left maniac with modest television ratings.
Trump, he's still got it, and he can dish out a cuss pretty easily, Trump. A radical left-wing maniac with modest viewers. That's so many. Ooh, ow, ooh.
And as soon as he says something that's a little bit modest or temperate, Fox and others put him on to explain, oh, look, Bill Maher, a lefty. Bill Maher is saying wonderful things. They play right into the hand of the enemy. It's amazing. I'm sure he laughs like hell at how stupid they are. They're kissing the ass of the enemy.
Politicians don't talk like that normally. This guy could be back in government, I would say, within 4 years, unless the Democrat Party, or I suppose the Republican Party, come up with someone who has that kind of rhetorical appeal, who has that kind of ease in front of an audience. If you're one of the people that just loathes Trump and thinks Trump is the worst thing that's ever happened in politics, I recognise how you might have come to those conclusions. If you're one of the people that likes Trump a lot, I can see why you would. There are reasonable arguments and assessments on both sides. But what I've said for a long time is if you are anti-Trump, you've got to look at the conditions that caused him. And when Matt Taibbi came on this show and he said that Trump understood that the Democrats couldn't argue with him on issues of corruption, funding, lobbying, not doing anything about Big Pharma, and the conditions that led to Trump, I think, have gotten worse since Trump. Do you think Biden's made a real difference since coming back in, tumbling about in his penny farthing? Do you think, few and things better since Joe Biden's been in, like the way he shut down Saudi Arabia, the great way that he's controlled farmer prices, the brilliant way that he's taken responsibility for the American economy? Oh no, none of that's happened, has it?
And in that case, his ass is not particularly pretty, is it? Not particularly pretty.
Like, who else would comment on someone's actual ass quality? That's Bill Maher's ass we're being invited to contemplate there. We went hard on Trump ages ago when he was running for the candidacy and stuff, but you gotta say, the guy's funny. Let's have a look at Krystal on Bill Maher, and maybe we'll have a look at Bill Maher's ass also. But Krystal is, of course, focusing, I would imagine, more than on Bill Maher's ass, perhaps on the economic conditions in America that are demoralizing most people, that are exacerbating the disparity between elites and ordinary Americans. Why is it happening? Who's to blame? Are we being invited to regard convenient scapegoats as the problem, whether it's like immigration on the right or ordinary working class Americans if you're from the left? Or is it Putin? Or is it Trump? Whose fault is it? Is anyone benefiting from this?
Part of this inflationary problem is because we put too much money into the economy. There's way too much government spending, and that's why we have inflation. So that's a large part of that. It's just basic economics. And
that is not basic economics. We had this thing called a pandemic. We had a supply chain crisis. And by the way, there's a war in Ukraine.
It's played a role.
So to act like the only reason we have problems now is because people got a little bit of money in their bank account is just not honest.
And a little bit of money, they got more than we spent in World War II. So don't act like
hold on.
Whoa.
Hold on.
Don't act like, you said don't act. Don't act like we had to react to the pandemic exactly the way we did. We had to spend $6 trillion.
Okay, but how about the trillions that the Federal Reserve shot at Wall Street? Somehow nobody gets upset about the rich people who got tons of money and tons of support, way more than working class people did.
Sure,
but
they
oh
do.
my God, people were able to feed their kids and they had a little bit of money in their bank accounts. It was the worst thing in the world.
No.
That is one small part of the inflation story. And it is, by the way, not the only thing that we can deal with to get out of this mess.
Well, gas
so
prices.
Biden has
Is it a small
advocated-
part, Jamie?
Gas prices we can largely attribute to an administration that's been waging war on the fossil fuel industry.
That's ridiculous.
And
They
now
drilled
demand,
more than everybody. I mean,
That's a talking point. That's not
U.S.
true.
production.
No.
Okay, U.S. production is up.
Well-
it will be at record levels next year.
Okay, well-
the fossil fuel companies themselves are flush with cash, but will not invest in new drilling because they would rather give it to their shareholders.
Okay, all right,
That's
wait.
the truth.
So, fossil fuel companies, record profits. Billionaires, record profits. The biggest wealth transfer in history. Whatever's gone on in the last couple of years, it benefited the most powerful interests in the world just fine. But how did the Federal Reserve want to deal with this? By lowering your wages. Federal Reserve Chair and former private equity exec Jerome Powell, that's a coincidence, has promised to tackle inflation by lowering workers' wages. If there's one thing that controls the world, it's ordinary people who don't earn much money. At the same time, he has declined to implement a law to reduce the skyrocketing paychecks of his former colleagues on Wall Street. This is precisely what Krystal is talking about. Invisible stimulus packages were offered to the financial industry, and even Bill Maher, who's hosting a show about this stuff, was unaware of it. This is what people mean when they say that the mainstream media manages the narrative. Certain information is highlighted, other information obfuscated, then our reality is derived from the available information. This is what we're trying to do on this channel. Highlight voices that are talking about important information that might otherwise be marginalized. While former private equity executive and Federal Reserve Bank Chair Jerome Powell takes aim at workers with a pledge to get wages down to combat inflation, he has declined to implement a law to reduce the skyrocketing paychecks of his former colleagues on Wall Street. He has also approved and financed a merger wave that critics say has inflated the cost of consumer financial services. Note how consistently and regularly ordinary people or people without much power are located as the cause of vast economic and social problems. But if you just keep in mind this idea, how can people that don't have much power have much influence? It sort of just stands to reason. It's a simple, systemic way of thinking about these matters. The 2010 Dodd-Frank financial reform law mandated the creation of a rule to rein in Wall Street bonuses. The rule is supposed to be developed and implemented by 6 regulatory agencies, including the Federal Reserve that Powell runs. But as he has sounded the alarm about inflation and wages, Powell has so far done nothing to help create that rule, even as Wall Street bonuses just hit an all-time record of $45 billion in a single year. So all the while we're talking about an economic crisis, the cost of living rising, there's been a world record year in bonuses. That doesn't make sense. How can those things not be connected? Wouldn't you feel that you were living in a more reasonable society if people said, look, the cost of living's gone up and people that are working in the financial industry are not earning as much money as they used to? It's extraordinary that we can't correlate these necessarily connected pieces of information. Dodd-Frank mandates that a Wall Street compensation rule require banks to ensure that their executive compensation packages do not incentivize risky behavior, such as risky lending to hedge funds like Archegos Capital Management, which collapsed in 2021 under the weight of hundreds of millions of dollars in loans from major banks like Goldman Sachs. We know that in 2008, there was an economic crisis that is still impacting the lives of ordinary Americans and people across the world to this day. That was precisely because of these types of behavior that no one's ever been prosecuted for, that there were stimulus packages introduced then as now to protect the elite and elite structures that dominate ordinary lives. So we cannot allow the mainstream media to continually locate ordinary Americans as the problem. This past February, Sarah Bloom Raskin, President Joe Biden's nominee to be the Fed's vice chair for supervision, promised to implement the law. Bloom Raskin withdrew her nomination amid opposition from corporatist Democrats and every Republican senator. So someone was going to implement that law. That person's gone away now. So the Biden administration isn't going to do anything, are they? In response to rising inflation, Powell could crack down on Wall Street bonuses, demand the closure of the private equity tax loophole, or use the Fed's power to block bank mergers. All just sensible suggestions for controlling the economy in ways that would be impactful without annihilating the lives of ordinary Americans. Instead, Powell's anti-inflation campaign has focused on raising interest rates to reduce the money supply, a policy that tends to increase unemployment and put downward pressure on rank-and-file workers' wages. The result is a much higher degree of misery for ordinary Americans, while the overall purchasing power of the country is reduced. Powell and the senior Fed leadership have little connection to that suffering. Powell was a senior executive at the Carlyle Group for much of his career, and his financial disclosures show an enormous investment portfolio worth up to $55 million. Imagine how different it would be if these positions at a national and local, federal and state level were filled by an assembly of elected officials drawn from the communities that they regulate, rather than an elite merry-go-round of individuals that operate only in this sphere, that have alliances only in this sphere, have an ideology that's about the protection of this sphere. How will you ever change America when utilising personnel that are invested in it staying the same? Let me know in the comments below if you know how this works. The Federal Reserve, or Fed, is the most powerful economic institution in the United States, perhaps the world. Its core responsibilities include setting interest rates, managing the money supply, and regulating financial markets. In essence, they create the financial conditions that you live within. And by identifying ordinary Americans as the problem, they are able to continue to protect the interests of the powerful while creating social tension, poverty, devastation. Meanwhile, the media will participate by stoking tensions between different cultural groups, so you never go, hang on a minute, what's actually happening? For much of the last year, the Fed was consumed with a scandal in which Powell's vice chair, as well as the heads of the Dallas and Boston Federal Reserve Banks, were found to have engaged in insider trading. So even within a corrupt system, they managed to find time for extracurricular corruption that they're not even supposed to be doing within their rigged and corrupt system. They cannot get enough corruption. They're corruption addicts. There has to be an intervention. They have to be stopped. And intervention at an international scale is revolution. The pandemic led to one of the greatest wealth transfers in history. So if you were to look at it with the template that, wow, this was a con. I'm not saying there wasn't a pandemic. I'm not saying coronavirus isn't real. I'm not saying anything like that. But if the objective was to generate more power for the powerful, more wealth for the wealthy, it was a success. Allegedly. While Russian billionaires have been the focus of attention due to the ongoing fighting in Ukraine and the ensuing sanctions against Russian individuals and entities, their counterparts in the United States added $5 trillion to their fortunes during the pandemic, according to Oxfam. $5 trillion is one of those numbers that's inconceivable. No wonder we have to continually identify convenient villains to target our attention towards. The total wealth of billionaires jumped from $8.6 trillion in March 2020 to $13.8 trillion in November 2021, a bigger increase than in the previous 14 years combined. During the pandemic, the ability of governments to regulate and control populations increased. The ability of big tech companies to control, observe individual data increased. The wealth of the most powerful institutions, individuals and elites in the world increased. So while it might have been a crisis in your life, it was not a crisis in their reality. You live in a different reality from them. You are governed by people that operate from within that reality, that take jobs in the various individual nodes within that sphere. How are you ever going to get change that meaningfully impacts your life from the individuals and institutions that operate within that strata? Let me know in the comments. The world's richest 10 men saw their collective wealth more than double, shooting up by 1.3 billion a day. So how are you going to get contradictory voices? How are you going to get oppositional voices? Where are these voices going to come from? Everyone agrees that power and wealth must be concentrated within that realm. Billionaires have had a terrific pandemic. Central banks pumped trillions of dollars into financial markets to save the economy, yet much of that has ended up lining the pockets of billionaires riding a stock market boom, said Gabriela Boucher, Oxfam's executive director. The same way that there could have been a regulation introduced that the pharmaceutical companies that profited from the medicines that emerged in the pandemic must redistribute that wealth and profit back into the nations and communities that, in many cases, developed the technology and medicines that they profited from, these financial packages should have been returned into the community as well. Bear in mind what Julian Assange said. The function of government is to transfer public money, that's your money, into private hands. If you remember that template, you'll see how frequently it plays out. And it seems to me that the current economic crisis is just another example of that paradigm playing out in our lives, in your lives, in our reality. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Your opinions and your views are more important than mine. Let me know what information we've missed. Let me know what information we could highlight. Remember to give this a thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel if you don't subscribe already. Turn on the notification bell so that we can cheat that algorithm into giving us everything that we deserve. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at either of these. And please sign up to my mailing list. Every week we do live online conversations on Zoom and other platforms. We do real life live events. We can build something together if you are willing to sign up to that mailing list right there. Please, more important than that though, stay free.